One of the key areas on the specification is thinking about the environment and how it affects crime, etc. So what we're going to do is look at housing and employment and think about what that means overall for the people and their experiences in Whitechapel, because you may get something like a key features, or you may have an element of this in your source questions. We dealt with housing in depth in the video focused on accommodation, so I want to focus on the other problems of overcrowding and poor quality housing and what this leads to in Whitechapel. Slum living in the rookeries and lodging houses had a major impact on health and crime. People would need to steal to survive, and according to the BBC, there are roughly 8,000 people using the 233 common lodging houses regularly. As we see in other areas of crime and punishment, slum landlords, the wealthy, were not held accountable for their crimes of putting people in such poverty. In 1871, the census showed that there are 902 lodgers staying in the 31 doss houses or lodging houses on Flower and Dean Street, and you can see how overcrowded Whitechapel was by the medical officer's report highlighting that 189 people lived in each acre, and that's versus 45 in the rest of London. So within this area, people would also drink heavily to forget their problems, which meant that slum living was a dangerous place, with arguments, violence, assaults, petty theft like pickpocketing being common. Streets were narrow, alleyways have no lighting, and it's a maze of alleyways, causing the police problems in chasing and pursuing criminals. Good proof of this is that in 1 mile of Whitechapel, on the main road, there was 45 buildings being used as gin palaces or pubs or opium dens, which meant that people had accessible, cheap liquor or drugs to forget their problems, meaning that it led to assaults, arguments, etc., and they were very commonplace. One of the key problems being caused by overcrowding was poor sanitation. This led to many diseases, which meant that life expectancy was very low. And if a member of your family died, then you were likely to lose your home, as everybody needed to earn to pay your bills. It's estimated that some poor working class families spend 8 shillings a week on rent when the average wage is 22 shillings and 4 pence. Now remember, that is an average wage, not a lot of people will be getting that. Life expectancy is low, and in some areas we said in the slums it was as low as in your 20s, but generally it was in your 40s, and infant mortality was very high. So if children made it out of childhood, then that was obviously a very positive thing. The funeral gave people a real sense of pride, and lots of money would be spent on these. So an example of this is that Brookwood Cemetery had a train line that ran specifically from London for funerals. So families would bring the body out, they'd have the funeral, and then they'd return on the train back up to London. So families often had a line of credit at their local store with the shopkeepers as well, and paid this off weekly. Now, on the streets, the problem of raw sewage caused many diseases like typhoid to spread, and this fever, untreated, obviously kills people. And this was transferred by bacteria, which was spread by drinking infected water with people's waste matter, or people obviously coughing around them. Cholera came from drinking infected water or eating food that had been in unclean water. Typhus and tuberculosis were also killers in the slums, and there were many major epidemics that happened before our period that we need to look at. But this close living and the overcrowding meant that these kinds of diseases spread quickly, and obviously there is no medical treatment for this. If you needed treatment, you would need to go to the workhouse. The quality of food people got in the slums is very poor, and shopkeepers use tricks such as mixing flour with chalk to make it last longer, mixing other things into food like ash in tea, things that people shouldn't be eating. So obviously this has a knock-on effect on their health. Now in 1890, after the Jack the Ripper case was brought the major problems of the slums to the attention of the people in the newspapers. The Houses of the Working Classes Act saw councils start to replace slums with low-cost, better quality housing, and we see that through the Peabody Estate and other movements. And in 1890, the Public Health Amendment Act gave the councils more powers to deal with having toilets, cleaning up waste, rubbish collection, sewage, etc. So dealing with these problems that actually caused the health problems for the people living in the slums. Toxic waste in the air, as we saw with pea supers, where you couldn't see in front of you, created by the kind of noxious gases released by boats coming in, by the factories, and the very poor quality housing leading to damp conditions meant that issues such as tuberculosis meant that it was really a deadly place to live in the slums, and actually health was incredibly poor. So lots of respiratory diseases for people, which made it hard for them to work. And then obviously that has a knock-on effect on crime because people need to steal to survive. Now, from a health and environment point of view, it will be quite hard to find some records. Now, the workhouse records potentially are ones that we could use for health purposes. They are ones that might tell us who sought help in the workhouses, their illnesses, their physical state, and whether they ended up in the infirmary. However, this doesn't actually tell us, because people use different names, so fake names. It doesn't actually tell us how many people did it or what their illnesses necessarily were. They could be misdiagnosed, as we know from plenty of times. Now, we could also check the census and see how many people were living at the addresses from the same families between the 10 years. However, this doesn't actually tell us if they died, so you need to cross-relate it to the death records, the death certificates. And they could have moved out. They could have just become homeless because of their circumstances. Remember, things change very quickly in the slums. And coroner's reports, I wouldn't use those either because they're only used for suspicious deaths. So things like the murders with Jack the Ripper, things that are very public, are coroner's reports, but they're not necessarily for the average person who hasn't died in suspicious circumstances. So, key features then of housing linked with the environment, linked with healthcare. Crime, clearly, we talked about that in the accommodation video. Poor sanitation, got lots of examples of open sewers and this causing a knock-on effect to people's health. The workhouse really being people's only option for them to go to overall if they are in trouble with their health. There is no healthcare. And overcrowding, spreading disease and enabling criminals to hide. Another key contributing factor to the poor environment of slum living was employment. Now, in the 1870s, there is that world economic recession, which puts people into a slump. There's a lot of immigration in Whitechapel. So a lot of this attitude of people coming in and taking jobs and being willing to work for lower wages. But don't forget, that's massive exploitation. And people were taking advantage of the poor as usual. So this creates a lot of tension in Whitechapel, which is another key theme, between Jewish immigrants who are seen to come in and take jobs in the sweated trades like tailoring, etc., and Irish immigrants who are coming in and doing kind of the physical manual labour and trying to work on the docks, building roads, railways and canals, etc. Now, one of the key features of Whitechapel is permanent employment. So you will see here that I've got a list of the different jobs that could be regarded as permanent employment in Whitechapel. However, don't forget there is a world economic recession in the 1870s, so jobs disappear. There are many unskilled labourers in Whitechapel. There's lots of tensions caused with immigrants in Whitechapel who seem to be coming in and undercutting the local residents and taking their jobs. But this does link with the world economic recession. It's not actually generally true, and people are being exploited by the owners of factories, etc. But the general theme is that wages were low. People generally earn 6 to 12 shillings per week, and remember, 8 is spent on permanent accommodation, so this is why everybody in the family needs to work. We're going to start with the sweated trade. So we're going to start with match girls. Now, they dipped wooden sticks into white phosphorus to make matches. Bryant and May is the main company in Whitechapel that does this, and they employ people in the factories and at home in sweatshop conditions. But in 1891, the Salvation Army set up a rival factory producing matches with harmless red phosphorus because it wasn't carcinogenic like white phosphorus. These are expensive, but they produce 6 million boxes a year. They do find it harder because it's more expensive to compete with Bryant and May, who end up taking them over in 1901. This type of employment is generally women and girls, and it's very poor pay. 14 hours a day for less than 5 shillings a week, which leads to a strike in 1888, and they could be fined by their overseer for anything like going to the toilet, dropping matches, talking. All those things would be taken off their pay. Now, the white phosphorus was known to cause phossy jaw, which damages teeth and gums and eventually causes brain damage, and other health complications were there from working with white phosphorus. Red phosphorus was used, which was safer, but couldn't compete in price with white phosphorus. So you could do this at home. Children could also do the job, and children died from eating white phosphorus. So there are kind of key examples of health problems that are caused by this white phosphorus overall. Now, our next sweated trade is tailoring. Tailoring and shoemaking by hand. Now, these are often had elements of skill to it, but there's also unskilled labour. Jobs such as button sewing, pocket making, were all completed in sweatshops, generally women and children, and a normal working day, as we said before, could be 15 to 20 hours. But men were also there as well. Women earn less than men and could be paid in food. Prices of coats, etc. vary from 5 shillings at one point to 3 shillings for the same garment later on. 8 shillings is the average wage in a sweatshop. Now this, like the dyes for different cloths, contain carcinogenic materials and cause serious health problems such as cancer. There's damage to eyesight and lungs from working in the sweatshops in the poor ventilation. And tuberculosis, acute backache, etc. are all kind of side effects of having this kind of employment. You don't know how many orders you're going to turn up and get, so you might have to take on help if you're doing this at home. And immigrants were skilled at this job and would work for low wages, which often put people out of jobs and causes tension within Whitechapel. And obviously there's, like the match girls, fines for taking rest breaks, poor quality work, etc. In Whitechapel, there was the Bell Foundry, which actually manufactured Big Ben. And they manufacture bells and their fittings, and they do Big Ben in 1858, like I said. Now, this was generally a male occupation, and it obviously, wages depend upon what kind of job you complete within the factory. So casting bells mean molten steel, making moulds, etc. So generally quite skilled labour, and obviously if you don't cast the bell right, then there are issues and people don't get paid. So generally this was quite a skilled job. The slaughterhouse then. Now this is something that the coroner suggested may well be one of the possibilities where somebody would work that could have been seen as Jack the Ripper, because obviously they had the skills to know exactly what they were doing. Shopkeepers, as we saw from Charles Booth's poverty maps, generally were better off. Now they were grocers and they'd often have to give credit to people, so they're kind of part money lenders as well. And they kind of were responsible for a lot of poor nutrition in Whitechapel. So they mixed goods with other things to make them go further so they can make more money. So things like tea is mixed with ash and wax, butter is mixed with milk with chalk and water, sugar mixed with sand, and obviously pawnbrokers were regularly attended by people in Whitechapel where they were pawning goods to get a bit of money and then hopefully going and buying their goods back. But on the whole, shopkeepers were also subject to obviously the economic circumstances. So if people did a moonlight flit, they were often left with a big bill for people that had been in their shops, and obviously people couldn't necessarily pay their credit. Running a lodging house then, you wouldn't necessarily be the owner. Okay, the owners are going to be wealthy people. But in 1851, the Common Lodging Houses Act meant that you were subject to sanitary regulations which limit the number of beds, and you have to notify the authorities of outbreaks of diseases. Now this is generally a job for a man. We talked before about the wages. You're going to charge 8p for a double bed, 4p for a single bed, and 2p to sleep on the rope. But there is a lot of risk of violence, disease, absentee owners, people not paying you money, it being on 8-hour shifts. So these aren't pleasant places to be in. And local authorities can actually set up their own lodging houses as well. But this is obviously affected by the Artisans' Dwelling Act in 1871, where we start to look at slum clearance and providing affordable housing for working class families. A costermonger or a hawker is a street seller. So they might sell meat, some sold cat meat, some sell fish, clothes, coffee, fish, all those kinds of things. Some travel while others stay in one place and have stalls. And you ended up having to pay £2 a year for a licence and to be registered. So many of these are not actually licensed. So men, women and children can do this job, but it depends upon how much you sell. slum clearance meant that you couldn't prepare your goods in your new house or keep carts in public places. Unlicensed sellers could actually be arrested by the police. There's evidence of violence in marriages for people not selling enough, and children from the age of 7 working on their own on the streets. But you're at risk of not having enough income to purchase more stock. Now, nationally, there is a figure of about 30 to 40,000 people using this occupation to make a living. There's an average of 14 stalls in each mile and 2,000 miles of streets in London. So this is something that people did very regularly as their employment. A charwoman is somebody that cleaned other women's houses who couldn't afford a full-time maid. So this is generally, you are cleaning in the middle class houses. So some people take in washing, and they often do this as the men's occupation is irregular, i.e. dockers. So women can choose when they work 9 to 10 hours a day. Potentially you're going to someone else's house, or you're taking in their laundry to your house. It is low paid. The average pay is 2 shillings, and it isn't necessarily regular work because it does depend upon the economic circumstances. Finally then, working in a laundry. So the men have the managerial overseer roles and get paid more, but jobs such as washing, ironing, mangling to kind of get the excess water out of the clothes are available. And this job had been completed at home, but then larger laundries developed. Now, if you've watched the film Suffragette, you'll see that they work in a large laundry. These are dangerous places. Ironing is better paid than general laundry, and you can't earn enough to support your family here. Now, a water shortage means that the businesses being run from home often meant that they're put out of business, and the East London Waterworks Company only supplied 6 hours worth of water a day in the 1890s. So they published propaganda against the poor wasting water, and people then were forced into working in the factories, and there were long hours and there was poor safety for these larger laundries. And as usual with all the others, you could be fined for different things, so they take your wages away. So we said earlier that many lost their jobs in the 1870s due to the economic recession. So temporary employment is all they can get. Now, this term tramping, or the term tramp, comes from this era. Men would often tramp the streets looking for a day's labour. So dockers or building railways offered a few days' work at a time. So these are only really temporary jobs. And a ship only needed to be unloaded when it arrived in port. So seasonal weather as well would prevent ships from arriving. So people would be kept in a cattle pen, and they would then a few would be chosen if need be if a ship arrived. So this would actually waste your day, and there's evidence of people being tramped to death when people were kind of clamouring for jobs and fights breaking out, etc., as you would expect. Now, likewise, the Irish do dangerous work of digging out the countryside for canals and railways. Now, they're nicknamed navvies for navigation, and there's very poor health and safety, and this leads to many injuries and deaths. So lots of people competing for work, or lots of men competing for work, and it being quite seasonal meant that obviously people had time. This led to a lot of violence and a lot of assault, and people being drunk and kind of trying to forget their troubles. I wanted to deal with prostitution on its own because there is this kind of myth about it, that this is something that women regularly did as their employment and chose this employment. But actually, women sold their bodies as a last resort. Okay, higher class ladies without any disease, or those that are obviously alcoholics, could actually work in a brothel. And you can see the facts and figures here, that there are 62 brothels in Whitechapel, even though these were illegal. Now, often, most women could not afford rooms in these places and are not being regular prostitutes. They're only perhaps trying to earn money to end up in a lodging doss house overnight. There were lower class prostitutes walking the streets trying to get customers, going to doorways or stairwells of flats or courtyards or alleyways. Remember, Whitechapel was a maze of streets. And this led to obviously unwanted pregnancies, which led to illegal backstreet abortions, where people ended up obviously dying from infection, etc. And St Mary's Church in Whitechapel is where we kind of hear of people walking around to try and keep warm at night, waiting for their customers, or people would go there looking to find themselves a prostitute. The police would arrest women, but what they wouldn't do is they wouldn't keep them in prison overnight. They didn't want them to have a nice, cosy, warm bed for the night. So they would kick them out about 1 a.m. and that obviously happens to one of Jack the Ripper's victims. Now, the victims of Jack the Ripper are an interesting case because they have been dismissed as prostitutes, but actually there's no record of 3 of them actually engaging in prostitution at all. The last victim, she obviously had her own room. And she was known to be a prostitute, but generally this is something that women go to as a last resort. This is get some pence, okay? They're going to only be staying in lodging houses overnight. And no customers mean no money, often no bed or place in the lodging house, which is safer than being on the streets. They're obviously subject to lots of violence. They could end up with many children who are forced out onto the street, particularly if they have a room. And this would obviously be danger for the children being out there at night as well. So this is not an occupation that people wanted. This is something people did out of desperation. Key features then that we can link in with employment that you would then back up with your specific examples. So temporary employment versus permanent employment. Unskilled labour, obviously linked in with immigration and causing problems between immigrants and tensions in Whitechapel between the different groups. Low wages, you can see that people are fined for everything, and exploitation by the owners. And then particularly thinking about it being dangerous for people's health as well.